The carbon, water, and nitrogen cycles. Our learning goals for today are to be able to describe the carbon, water, and nitrogen cycles. Here's a picture of our Earth. The Earth is a closed system. We receive energy from the sun, and we may re-radiate energy back out into space, but we don't receive new material here on Earth for all intents and purposes. Everything that we have is everything that we're ever going to have here on Earth. Unless we get hit by a big asteroid or a comet or something, everything that's here is all that we're going to have. So we say it's a closed system. We exchange energy with our surroundings, but not matter. So what that means is that all the things that life needs have to be recycled. And the water, carbon, and nitrogen cycles are part of Earth's recycling system. So let's talk about the carbon cycle first. Carbon exists in the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. Carbon is a prime element in almost every molecule of your body, so all living things are made of lots and lots of carbon. So let's follow carbon as it moves from the atmosphere through the biosphere and back into the atmosphere. So atmospheric carbon is taken up by producers. When producers perform photosynthesis, they take in atmospheric carbon dioxide and convert that to sugar. And the sugar is used for energy for producers and also for energy by consumers who eat the producers. And decomposers eventually get a hold of the energy that's stored by producers in photosynthesis, because when producers and consumers die, they're decomposed. And producers, consumers, and decomposers perform something called cellular respiration, which we're going to learn about in another unit. But cellular respiration turns that sugar that was made through photosynthesis, it turns that sugar back into carbon dioxide, and then that carbon dioxide is released by decomposers, consumers, and producers back into the atmosphere. Some of the carbon that's in our bodies is converted by the decomposers into fossil fuels like coal and oil and natural gas. And humans have learned to find these fossil fuels, and we use them for industrial activity. We burn them for energy, and when we do, we release large amounts of carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. So that's the carbon cycle. Now hit the pause button, answer these questions, and when you're ready, push play. So how does carbon dioxide leave the atmosphere? It leaves the atmosphere through the process of photosynthesis. Producers take in carbon dioxide, convert it to sugar through the process of photosynthesis. What are three ways carbon dioxide enters the atmosphere? In other words, how does it get back to the atmosphere? Well, respiration, cellular respiration by producers, consumers, and decomposers. And how does human activity add to the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere? When we burn fossil fuels, we take carbon that's been stored in the fossil fuels and turn it into carbon dioxide by burning the fossil fuels and add it to the atmosphere. So let's talk about the water cycle. You guys have all studied this many times before, so this is nothing new. All right, so water on Earth is present in the atmosphere as water vapor, in the oceans, and in lakes, rivers, and streams on land. So let's see how water cycles through these three areas. So first thing is, water gets into the atmosphere through evaporation from the oceans, About 3 feet of ocean water evaporates every year. If water was not returned to the ocean, the sea level would drop 3 feet every year. That's an awful lot of water. Water also evaporates from lakes, rivers, and streams on Earth, and plants return water to the atmosphere through a process called transpiration, which we're going to study later in the year, but it's basically water evaporating from plants. So those are 3 ways that water returns to the atmosphere: evaporation from the oceans, evaporation from land, and transpiration from plants. Water leaves the atmosphere by the process of precipitation. So the water vapor is turned into rain, snow, sleet, and so forth, and falls out of the sky. Now, the Earth is 70% ocean, so 70% of the precipitation falls into the ocean directly. But some of it strikes land. And the water that strikes land returns to the land in 2 ways. It can return as what we call surface runoff. That's water that hits the surface, stays on the surface, and runs off, ends up in lakes, rivers, streams, and so forth, and eventually makes its way back to the ocean. Some of the water that strikes the surface of the earth sinks into the ground and becomes groundwater. Groundwater eventually makes its way back to the ocean too. So if we put it all together, here's the entire water cycle. Push pause, answer the questions, and when you're ready, push play and listen to the answers. How does water leave the atmosphere? It leaves the atmosphere through precipitation, both into the ocean and onto land. What are 3 ways that water enters the atmosphere? Evaporation from the ocean is a major way, evaporation from land, and transpiration from plants. What is groundwater? Groundwater is water that's seeped into the ground, and it makes its way back to the ocean. What is runoff? Runoff is water that stays on the surface of the earth and runs off back to the ocean. And what are 3 ways that water returns to the ocean? Well, surface runoff, groundwater, and precipitation into the ocean. Let's talk about the nitrogen cycle. Nitrogen is important because nitrogen is part of all the proteins in your body as well as your DNA and RNA. So every living thing needs nitrogen. Our atmosphere is 78% nitrogen. It's a gas. Unfortunately, you can't use that nitrogen. So even though every time you take a breath, most of the air you breathe in is nitrogen, you can't use it in that form. But luckily for us, there's a couple of ways that nitrogen in the atmosphere can be used by living things. One thing is that lightning in the atmosphere will convert some of the nitrogen into a form that can be used by living things. But the major way is by bacteria that live in the soil, and they can convert the atmospheric nitrogen into a form that can be used by living things. So bacteria in the soil fix the nitrogen, so we call them nitrogen fixing bacteria. This is a hugely important step in the cycle. The nitrogen fixing bacteria convert the nitrogen in the atmosphere into a form that producers can use, so they absorb it from the soil and they make proteins and DNA and so forth. And consumers get their nitrogen from producers, and carnivores and 3rd level and 4th level consumers get their nitrogen from other consumers, and decomposers get their nitrogen from everybody, because eventually everything dies. And decomposers return nitrogen to the atmosphere as a gas. So this is our cycle. So push pause, answer the questions. When you're ready to hear the answers, push play. Why do all living things need nitrogen? We need nitrogen to produce proteins and nucleic acids like DNA and RNA. What are two ways that nitrogen in the atmosphere becomes available to living things? One is lightning. Lightning converts nitrogen in the atmosphere into a form that producers can use. But the major way is through nitrogen-fixing bacteria. They take the nitrogen in the atmosphere and convert it to a form that producers can use. Where do consumers get their nitrogen? Well, primary consumers get their nitrogen from plants, from producers, and carnivores get their nitrogen from other consumers. How does nitrogen get from living things back into the atmosphere? Decomposers release nitrogen into the atmosphere.